All right, so I had this weird case for an app that I'm building. I have this app called anesthesiacharting.com, and it's a progressive web app that lets you chart sedation. So if you're a dentist or an ophthalmologist or something who does what they call moderate sedation, so not full general anesthesia, but moderate sedation, they have to record a bunch of stuff for this, and it's really complex. And so I teamed up with a dentist, and we built an app that solves this. That basically just walks you through a process of creating an anesthesia chart, which can be quite tedious. But I had this weird realization that I didn't ever want the software to update in the middle of a case, because if for some reason they're in the middle of a procedure, I don't want the software, for some reason, like if they refresh or whatever, if they have to, like, all of a sudden I don't want it to like change on them in the middle of a case. That seemed really important. I wanted it to, I tested each release thoroughly, and I wanted that release to be good. And I don't want to like have any opportunity of screwing that up if they're right in the middle of tracking a surgery, right? So that seemed pretty important. But it turns out that's really not how service workers are really meant to be used, seemingly. If you look at something like Workbox, which is a great tool, it really is built on this idea where you run this thing that generates a file manifest generates a file manifest that it injects into your service worker. So with each release, it's describing the files that are part of that particular release. And the problem with that is it makes it really difficult to then manage whether or not an application can update from the code already. So because the browser is kind of in control of that. If they shut the tab down and reopen it, I may have cached a bunch of stuff locally, and I want it to be like back up and running immediately. That's part of what's interesting about this is if we run a little mock case here, it goes through this whole tour mode, but none of this patient data is being saved. It's all being saved locally. It's not being saved on a remote server somewhere. So all we're doing is storing a ton of stuff in IndexedDB as you're working, and that means if you refresh partway through, it always has to be there. So I'm caching a ton of data locally. So it's really, really important that I don't change the shape of that data for that case until we the final output is just a PDF report. So we ship it off and print a PDF with that data. But that way we never have to store it anywhere other than on the client device, which is nice for HIPAA. So the question is then how do you do this? And so what I came up with is this approach that I'm calling kind of permanent service worker. So rather than use Workbox or something like that, I actually write a service worker that doesn't change. I've literally been using the exact same published service worker now for like several months, and this software gets used on surgeries every day almost. So it's working quite well, and it effectively it lets the application decide whether or not it should update, which is kind of unique, I think. So how do you do this? So what I did is, normally you have some sort of build process that kicks out your service worker. Well, in this case, the output of that is this. So I wrote something that loops through and just kicks out a manifest, a file manifest describing the assets that are required to run this app. But rather than generating a JavaScript file, I just generate a manifest file that's available to be downloaded by the service worker. The service worker stays unchanged. And so this is my service worker in its entirety. It reads from IndexedDB, so there's this cool little lib called idbkeyval written by Jake Archibald, and that's what I'm using here. So if we look at the application tab in the keyval here, we just have, this is actually the current version of the app and whether or not an update is available. And if it is available, then we kind of show that here. So we publish a little version here. This comes from the service worker into the app. And so the app boots up from the service worker, and the way that it works is this thing can determine whether or not, like, this is where the version can be switched by passing messages to the service worker. The service worker can then say, all right, we're flushing this cache, the previous cached assets, and we're creating new ones. So if we look at the caches, so here we have version 2. So here's all the assets for 2.86, which is what we're on. And by creating a separate cache for each deploy, so when the service worker boots up, it basically goes and downloads that cache manifest. So you can see here that ServiceWorker manifest.json file, it downloads that file that describes the most current release, including the version number and the assets it contains. It then actually goes ahead and downloads all those things. So, right, so we fetch the manifest, get the version from that, the current version by asking the app, and then we can determine whether we have, so we can actually go download all those pre-cache URLs, make sure that we have them all, and then if there isn't a version, we set it. And if the versions don't match, we then send a message to all connected clients saying that there's an update available and the version number of that update. So on the application side, here's, let me go to the code there. So here we have in my actual app code, this is what communicates with the service worker, right? So this is the other side of the boundary. And it, there's a helper for sending messages, passing messages to the service worker. And when it boots up, it runs this init function here, checks to make sure that, service worker exists, blah, 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 and that it's turned on. And then it listens for messages from the service worker. And then at the point where it decides, so we have this thing, I like to call them reactors, but it's essentially a function that pays attention to these various things and then can trigger another action if a certain redux state exists. So if you're familiar with reselect, this uses reselect to kind of generate these selectors. And in certain cases, it fires off an action. So there's the do update service worker action, which is if you're not currently in a case, it will just automatically update and it will refresh the page in front of you. Because we've already downloaded all the assets, that refresh is super fast and pretty painless. And that way there's no way for them to start the next case on the previous version. That way they're always up to date. But then this do update service worker, so it first just tracks the state initially by dispatching an action and then sends a message to the service worker, hey, I'm ready to upgrade. And when it does that, the service worker then takes that and says, all right, and actually switches out the cache, the current selected cache that it's using, right? And then we actually force a refresh here. So we actually reload the app once we get the message back that it worked, right? So that works really well. And in this way, like the app gets to decide whether or not you could update. And you could literally make an application that managed its own versions entirely. So right now I'm making it so that it always just throws you at the latest version when you pick upgrade. But you could literally make an app that lets you switch between 5 different versions. Like you can actually pass the control of the service worker update to the application, which obviously is a little dangerous too, because you could totally shoot yourself in the foot, right? But it would be possible to make an application using this technique that lets you selectively upgrade and downgrade potentially, because now the control of that update process has been passed off to the app. And part of what I like about this is if you've ever done a lot with progressive web apps, it's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot anyway. So, by never having to touch the service worker, like I know that thing works. I don't need to revisit it every time. There's no chance of it screwing up a deploy because it works the exact same way, and it's literally the same code running all the time, which is pretty neat, I think. So anyway, in case you need something crazy like this, yeah, check it out. Hope you like this. Hope you found it useful.